Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Campus Consortium's EdTalks featuring University of Rochester. Today's topic for the EdTalk is Enrollment Management and Student Success, a Unified Approach. Our presenters include Jonathan Burdick, Dean and Vice Provost for the University of Rochester, and John Wanamaker, Executive Director at Campus Consortium. We will take questions at the end of today's presentation that have been typed into the chat box or questions pane in the GoToWebinar control panel. Without further ado, please allow me to present Mr. Wanamaker and Mr. Burdick. Over to you, John.
Hi, Sharon. Thank you. And thank all of you for joining us today for what I'm sure will be an engaging and informative session on the increasingly important topic of college enrollment. We'd like to also thank our sponsors of today's EdTalk, as their sponsorship makes it possible for the Campus Consortium to deliver grant awards that help drive innovation at K-12 and higher ed institutions across the globe. It is the mission of the consortium to help members reduce the time, cost, and effort associated with implementing enterprise IT services by leveraging shared IT services, lessons learned, and best practices. Thank you very much, Mr. Jonathan Burdick, for joining us today. A little bit about Jonathan Burdick from the University of Rochester, where he is Dean and Vice Provost. Jonathan oversees university financial aid, marketing, undergraduate, and international admissions. He has contributed to the field for 33 years with a focus on increasing campus inclusiveness and internationalization. While delivering enrollment success at Rochester, he has also traveled worldwide on behalf of the College Board, Educational Testing Service, and the International Baccalaureate Organization. He is a frequent speaker at numerous annual national and international conferences and has been widely cited in both the press and social media, and has recently been awarded the National Association for College Admissions Counseling's Inclusions, Access, and Success Award in 2016. With no further ado, I now turn this over to Dr. Jonathan Burdick from the University of Rochester. Jonathan?
Well, thank you very much, John. I'll dive right into welcome everybody. It's nice to have the chance to talk about these issues and questions that have consumed my entire adult life, and I hope that there's some great, interesting questions coming from you that can provoke some thoughts in me. I do indeed have to present on this kind of information all the time. Just last week, I was presenting this information to my own board, which is probably the most confused set of people that I can present to on a topic like this, because, of course, they know the university inside and out in every way, but looking at it through a different lens is often challenging, and I expect that's something that is true in many of your lives as well. So I will begin by setting up my slideshow, and hopefully we will get right underway. So the goal of enrollment management is pretty clear. We're trying to get and keep and graduate happier students. It is more so than maybe any other measure of the university entirely focused on the student experience and student activities. There are other offices where that's their primary goal, but they are farther from the business financial operation of the university. So we occupy that intersection where the money meets the student experience most directly. And it is probably the case that what we call enrollment management today appeared even just 10 years ago in most places, and still does in a lot of places, as just admissions, financial aid, the separate offices and functions. And so those things still go on, whether you call yourself an EM or an enrollment management operation or not. There are all these things that you have to do that fit in that category. But enrollment management is increasingly taking over at almost every kind of college and university. And in many of those operations where it has already been created, it is now expanding. So a little bit about how it works. As I said, enrollment is kind of in the middle of the organization. I'll talk a little bit more about the ways in which enrollment intersects. There are many, many more ways than I can list here or in this brief time, not least the budget office, the housing office. The focus right now is not on those. I think that anybody who understands universities as a business, whether public, private, profit, nonprofit, probably can understand that those logistical efficiencies in the budget side and the and the question of housing for residential campuses can be pretty big influencers and influenced by enrollment. But I'm going to focus more on the things that are less well understood or less anticipated maybe, and have to be negotiated and ironed out one place at a time. So we're trying to deliver services the more efficiently, the more effectively, the better, again, to make students get into and through and out of the institution. One thing that I have hinted at and would describe as a fairly complete truth in my world is I have never found any two campuses sitting side by side with their enrollment management, whether it's their team or the individual charged and tasked with enrollment management. And I sit beside people with that title all the time. They would never agree 100% about what structures have been created within their operation. They would never be able to say with certainty what they control versus the next person over from them at a slightly different institution, even if it's only 10 miles away, might have a different set of controls, a different set of factors. One of the hardships that I think is resolving over time and will resolve even better in the near term is the question of metrics. What do we mean when we say an enrollment management operation is successful? It is not as simple at first glance. There's probably one thing that you could get almost everybody to agree on, which is that enrollment management is designed to produce on-time graduation from the school where they intended. Even that can get a little bit hinky as a core description, especially if that focus becomes so total that it's inimical, that it destroys the opportunity to think about other institutional goals. And those might be how an institution relates to its community. It might be a case of what's true to that university's mission that goes above and beyond or within this basic question of students coming and graduating. And certainly probably the least common point of agreement is resources. And that's because institutions come with different kinds of controls beyond enrollment management. Public universities, state universities have a different resource base than private universities. Most typically within private universities, there are very wide-ranging questions about what kind of personnel are necessary to get things done. We actually collectively, as a set of enrollment managers or admissions and financial aid and registrar professionals around the country, are more or less constantly talking and comparing about, even down to the level of what can we pay or what should we be paying the basic core group of employees that are under our direction. We wrangle all the time about what degree of IT belongs with us, managed by us, versus where we search outside. There are other functions where we might, in our dream world, have better or more control over what the university does, but sometimes are entirely outside of our control. And so there's a lot of variety when you say the world enrollment management. I have a good friend in New York who's a data scientist, and he was making that point to me about his life. Data science doesn't mean anything consistent from one venture to another, one industry to another. The one probably constant there is that data science involves a lot of cleaning up of bad data, and I would say enrollment management has that one constant, that on some level they are trying to help students make reasonable progress through the curriculum that's been established. This is sort of a pretty well-informed and well-guided list from all of these dozens of years of conversations and evaluating both the operations I've been part of and other places where we have a lot of conversation. The most common functions in enrollment management, it's not an accident that this grows out of admissions professionals and the admissions responsibility primarily. That is probably the one thing that you couldn't say you were an enrollment manager if you didn't have some basic core responsibility for admissions. Of course, admissions itself is a pretty broad category. There's everything from prospecting and identifying suspects and upfront kinds of marketing, all the way through to the point of helping guide students through their standard upfront admissions process and into the admissions process for specific majors, even within a single degree program. And admissions people can contribute to all of those. There is a whole set of ancillary operations and activities that are influenced by admissions, as we certainly discovered or were reminded last week. Two of the big pipelines to admissions are advancement, development, fundraising, and alumni legacy kinds of operations, and athletic operations. So even when you say the word admissions, it isn't as tight-knit as you might think. Financial aid, a similar set of questions there about what financial aid might mean, but that's very, very commonly, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in detail later, it's very commonly a piece of an enrollment management operation. Registrar is a common piece, probably more than half of enrollment management functions. Registrar has become part of that. And then you get into things that are far less common, but a large percentage of enrollment operations have one or more of these affiliated. MARCOM is the buzz term of choice for marketing and communications. I think most of us understand that there are things that universities market and communicate about that go beyond the enrollment management function. There is public relations, there is advertising that supports faculty activities and research. There are general public demands and dialogues about big, hefty, expensive institutions in the midst of various communities. So marketing and communication usually has some elements that go beyond what you'd consider the enrollment management, but it would be typical and I think accurate to say that a large fraction of the web traffic on a university's main website is prospective students and their parents and others who support them. So that kind of relationship can be very important, and there are certainly probably some elements of marketing and communication that properly belong within or at least closely affiliated with enrollment management. And then Bursar, tricky one. Best practices would say that the financial aid money you give and the Bursar money you take would be divided, but from the point of view of the students navigating one-stop shopping to handle both of those functions can be pretty important. So this one-stop shopping service for financial transactions becomes an issue. We get into some trickier things farther down this list, but advising, institutional research, student employment, orientation, all of which have their own big spin-offs and dimensions and issues, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. But there is, in some cases and on some campuses, arguments to be made for including those things within the enrollment management tent entirely. Institutional research, obviously, that's a tricky one because, again, there are lots of things we have to report out about as institutions that go beyond how we're managing our students. Okay, I'll move on. Enrollment managers probably feel like they are the target of a lot of attention, and appropriately so. And of course, the other reason for that image is because we have to hit a target. That's probably one of the constants we have across the three main structures we have: admissions, financial aid, registration. These are all things that are big peak activities. We plan for and gear up for a specific time, and then we execute at a specific time, more so than most elements of the university. Everybody appears for terms, and there are starts and ends that matter in every part of the university's management activity, but an admissions person will say in all seriousness that they are sort of fighting a Super Bowl every year, and they're really often only feeling like their success is only as good as the most recent year they've had, just like the Patriots must be feeling right now. You have to start right back up again on an annual cycle and get it going, and there are similar kinds of concerns and issues with how financial aid and registration will go. So again, repeating here, there is no agreement about the structures, controls, metrics, or resources, but there is growing to be at least some kind of structural model to how enrollment management is working on a lot of campuses as it becomes a more accepted and commonplace term for what campuses are doing. And it goes to both extremes, and both are viable in different ways. You can have a chief enrollment management officer. For years that was just chief enrollment officer, but that CEO came into all kinds of trouble and interrupted what presidents and chairmen of the board thought they were. So CEMO seems to be emerging as the right sort of acronym that describes who we are and what we do. It can be a very big operation. Admissions offices are often full of people to do all kinds of services at peak times. The same can be true in financial aid. The same can be true in registrar. So often a top-down CEMO would have quite a lot of personnel and a big share of the personnel budget in their portfolio. And then you can have a decentralized model where you've got maybe a university registrar or maybe a specific registrar for specific schools within that university or college. Admissions can be very famously decentralized, including very different, extremely different decentralized models between undergraduate and graduate enrollment or degree programs at different levels. There are admissions activities related to visiting students and guests, returning students who are re-enrolling after a period away. These can kind of scatter in a lot of places. That's even just within the things that nominally are called enrollment, but of course it gets even bigger when you think about all these other ancillary offices, not ancillary, but these offices that have different kinds of core responsibilities and how they relate back to the enrollment function. Where everything can, if you have a decentralized model, and lots of places do, you're obviously depending a great deal on cooperation. It is probably more time consuming in some respects to get the right things done with respect to enrollment, and there may be costs on that side to various kinds of efficiencies. Most places are somewhere in between these two extremes, just like the public and private sector in the economy. It's not usually all one or all the other. So a basic rule of thumb is that with the economies of scale, greater centralization under one kind of branching authority brings some efficiencies. There are things you can know and learn and enact more quickly, and they can be more coherent and more clear. Everybody knows who it is that's ultimately the decision maker in a pile of decisions that need to be made, sometimes on the fly and in a hurry. Everybody knows who is responsible for all of the things that everybody wants to see, more applications if that's part of your model, certainly more enrollment or less enrollment or whatever your goal might be, different kinds of enrollment, different shapes to your class. And then it's an inherent part of strategic planning. I don't think there is a university that doesn't incorporate thinking carefully about its student body and what it looks like relative to the marketplace, what it looks like on the campus or in the campus environment of any kind. And if you're going to do strategic planning, enrollment is clearly and immediately pulled into that. In my case, one of my first steps coming to Rochester in 2003 as an enrollment manager was to very quickly hear that there was a plan for growth. And one of the things that I was able to successfully argue was that we needed to expand the range of program offerings. So I became very closely tied quickly with faculty who had to think about what kinds of program offerings, majors, and activities they could bring with existing faculty and what kind of new lines they would need to develop in order to appeal to a broader audience. A decentralized environment, and I have worked mostly in relatively decentralized environment, one of the advantages it brings is that a architecture faculty knows better what's going on in the world of architecture than a general enrollment management operation that has architecture as one of its responsibilities. And so there are some important information out there in the world about the market forces and demand that, if it's a centralized enrollment management office operation, need to be fed in pretty well, coming from a source that is not normally part of a CEMO's activity. So building that connective tissue to different disciplines and their markets, both coming in and going beyond the degree program that they're offering, is a critical factor, typically not solved by centralization within enrollment management. And then just generally closer ties to academic culture. Even in a good enrollment management operation, it is often the case that the faculty don't necessarily feel like they know as much as they ought to know or should know about what's going on in those operations over there. There's the typical faculty staff or faculty administration bureaucrat bloat kind of conversation, finger pointing divide going on, and a stronger enrollment management operation that is getting far afield from faculty and their sense of themselves and their understanding, or even to some extent away from the current students and their priorities, might be stepping into a different cultural element, and that can certainly cause issues. So from an enrollment manager's viewpoint, what's the ideal model or what matters the most? There are three things, and I've described them a little bit already, but I'll say this is analogous, and I apologize if this is makes anybody freak out at this time because of the crash that happened in Ethiopia a couple of weeks ago. But basically, you're flying a plane. You've got to take it off at the right time, whether that's admissions or financial aid or registration cycles, and you've got to land it at the right time in the right place. And you want to have the right kind of controls to be able to do that task well. And so if you don't have institutional messaging, if you are not in charge of what gets said to prospective students, for instance, no real influence of what goes up on the website, no conversations that way, you have strictures and scripts about what your tour guides say, that are not allowed to deviate or in any way respond to the audience that you're actually carrying around campus, whether that's sixth graders or heavy donors. That's a real problem. You are sort of missing the navigation instruments you need, and you might get to exactly where you've aimed to go, but you are certainly going to miss important things along the way. That is, at the very least, important feedback for the campus as a whole. So you need a little bit of freedom of operation and some security about the ability to message and to identify the right kinds of messaging approaches for the audience in front of you. If you're missing the opportunity to select your class to do admission, in other words, admission is entirely controlled by faculty within their departments and not at all a part of a centralized enrollment management operation, you are not really able to participate in gradually changing students over time. One of the things I've learned very well over time is that on a college campus, for all best reasons, faculty are a fairly conservative element. They understand what got them where they are. They understand what has worked in their classrooms, in their labs, and with their students, and they want, by and large, to be able to repeat those things well. I don't mean that they're lacking in innovative energy. It's just they have a core sense of what an institution is year after year after year. And so the world that enrollment management officers confront is often very different, where there's a lot changing about the technology and the market and what students expect, and both from rivals and peers and from collaborators and just generally from a different set of 17-year-olds arising with a new generation. We're getting past Generation Z, and pretty soon we'll be looking at our Generation Alpha students being born and thinking about what they're going to expect in college campuses. And so you can't really create change on your campus. And I've never been on a campus that wasn't desiring to change something. Better students, more students, students of a different character, students that better match globally or internationally or locally in some way, and some sense of motion and forward momentum related to the mission, but nonetheless reflecting the change that happens over time in a potential student body and a current student body on campus. And then ultimately, if you're not at all at the table when there's questions of how much to raise tuition by and what that's supposed to mean in terms of generating net revenue and delivering that, you're only in charge of the admission and not the financial aid. You are only as good as that one engine is going to be, and it can be a great big selective powerful engine where that choice making is really important in defining who comes and who's there and what they get. But more often it's the case that how much incentivizing, how much discounting you give and what your price is has a pretty big influence on which students choose to enroll and even students' choice to stay. And so you need that second engine, that sort of twin engine model to be successful. Okay, enrollment clearly acts as the elephant in the room. There's very little that goes on other parts of college campuses that doesn't care a lot about what the enrollment people are doing. But, and this is kind of important to understand, that goes both ways. It just feels and looks different. Just a set of places and offices on campus where the enrollment management function matters a lot, the academic and career advisors, orientation, the academic assistance programs, institutional research wants to know that enrollment is managing things a certain way and coming up with the same kinds of definitions that match what they need and how they need to learn. Retention programs, student services. Very rarely are these things considered core responsibilities of a chief enrollment management officer or an enrollment management operation. They are understood and known to be things that are better served by a different set of tools, by people who maybe have a different kind of patience and a different kind of expectation of what their day is like, versus enrollment people sort of moving very cyclically through a year. So it's there's a contrast in culture there that means they're probably going to be housed in different ways, but they do matter to each other. And all of those other offices that I just listed are going to benefit or suffer based on what happens in enrollment management. And they know this. I have never seen a committee brought together across different parts of student services or even the academic parts of function campus tasked with something important to evaluate or change on that campus who didn't need to pull in some understanding of what goes on in admission financial aid and some of what the enrollment operations would say about this question. It feels different because it's very asymmetrical. Everybody wants to know what's happening to me on May the 1st. They want to know what's happening to me on May the 1st, and they're asking on March the 19th and they're asking very seriously about what the answer is going to be on May the 1st. It matters a great deal to everything in the course of their next month, their next year, their next few months, and it's something that they'll have to respond to for a long time, even though for me it's that 1 year deliverable. There are other intermediate deliverables for admissions. There are several through the course of a year for both financial aid and registrar, but still a lot of high impact, sudden, immediate, maybe this is just human nature, but students respond to the requests and expectations we have. 80% of them respond in the last 10% window of the time they're given to do anything. That's never going to change. It hasn't changed with technology. In some ways it's gotten worse in that a big fraction respond much earlier and faster because of the technology, but then even more know that they can submit things at the last minute. Just an example for us, 20% of our applications come on the last day. So we don't know they're coming until they are, but people are going to ask me 5 days before the deadline, how's it going? And I can't be able to tell them with any assurance. So basically, student service and advising offices, that list, they depend on us for really good news at critical intervals, and they are watching and waiting for that as impatiently or patiently as they might. Meanwhile, apologize for the dogs, we have a need to be assured that all these things that students expect, that make them want to come and make them want to stay and ensure that they're going to do well and they're going to graduate, that those services are being delivered effectively and helpfully and are considered pluses for the university. But for that, we just need assurance that these are steady efforts, that there's constantly an ability for us to refer a student into the advising system or to get ready for an orientation, and that activity is going to go well and is going to happen very, very well. Again, apologies for the dog. I can't quite quiet it down. Okay, and we're almost done. Just a sense of the changes that are coming. This is my last slide. There are a lot of changes in demographics. I think most people who aren't under a rock probably hear about this from time to time, how the US population in particular is changing. The international population is changing a lot as well, has changed very significantly over the last decade and a half, and is changing again. There is a lot of worry and fretting about that. I tend to think that all the demographic changes we've seen before, the baby boom, the baby trough, they've all sort of developed their own answers that are appropriate to continue to support the functions and the needs of college. I'll talk a little bit about how enrollment management looks at the whole college process and how that's going to be successful. But it is important. If you do not know in the Northeast or the upper Midwest of the United States right now that your high school graduates are evaporating to a significant degree in the range of 20 to 25% at the lowest part of the trough, and in some cases never coming back, you are not doing your job for your campus. You need to be having that conversation and letting people know what's going on moment by moment. Price issues have always been important in our mission. They become significantly more important since the Lehman Brothers crash in 2008. This is the longest financial trough that any of us have dealt with for anything. To me, some of the responses were predictable, that they were of the similar nature to other, I'm old, they were similar to other financial, economic, external changes that I've seen, but they've lasted longer and they've been deeper. So as just one example of that, in these circumstances, students are much more likely to fly to secure harbors like engineering and medicine that seem to be predictable, paying jobs and opportunities, and away from the liberal arts and business. But as you come out of that economic circumstance, and there's a lag time in college universities by a couple of years, they're more likely, with the full employment that we have, with the sort of better economic news that's been going forward for a while now, to feel free once again to choose these somewhat riskier things. So we will, and I think we're already in a sea change where the engineering and medicine that's been so dominant for about 10 years will start to give way to some of the more unpredictable and interesting kinds of programs that students can do. 17, 18-year-olds, of course, are making this choice one time. They're not sophisticated consumers. They can make very, very poor choices. So basically our responsibility is to make sure they have as much transparent and good information as we can give. Even once they get on campus, we might say that we've done everything we can do to identify the students who are most likely to be successful on our campus and given them the tools to do it. Whether and how they use those tools are unpredictable. The very best universities and colleges in the United States don't have a 100% graduation rate, and truly should probably not aspire to that, because it is almost impossible to imagine that every student is exactly and appropriately matched for the very first outset. So acknowledging that and building that into your models and expectations is a good thing. That said, if you can build a 4-year cohort that lasts and 90% of them succeed together, that adds benefits that are worth noting. Colleges seem to be playing a role, especially in this country and to a lesser extent, but meaningfully around the world, of a rite of passage, that movement from adolescence and childhood into adulthood. I would say that for at least 20 years, I've been hearing predictions that brick and mortar are going away and everybody's just going to learn online at home the way we're all doing now. But it turns out that at least at some point in life, children seem to still value that chance to, in one sense or another, go away or identify themselves as being part of a specific learning environment designed and optimized for them. So we go forward on that basis, not necessarily thinking that everything that we do is going to be virtual overnight. There's going to be tremendous additions from virtual education, and there are similar kinds of questions and issues in virtual education that have to be solved, but there is still seemingly a lot of power in the minds of students in this gathering into a place specifically with the goal of learning and studying over a significant fraction of time. There's also continuing proof that this kind of education, this higher education that we provide, does add value. The most bare metric that's often presented is, what's the income? What do students graduate into? What kind of jobs? What kind of income are they making? What's their lifetime income? Are they paying back their loans? All critical and important questions, but I think you'd find that most people in college, much less those who graduate from college, would be more likely to say that there were a lot of other things that they expected and learned and took away from their college experience. And we haven't come up with great metrics even for the question of income and what part of income was increased or added based on the attending a specific college versus the inputs from the students that came into that college in the first place. So if we haven't got good data there, we have even less good data about other kinds of satisfaction and value that people would meaningfully ascribe to their college experience. And that's my sort of call to arms for everybody who's involved in this business, is that innovation and technology is coming. On my own campus, we have had many opportunities to look at robust data science and all the information that's being gathered through Google and Facebook and every other kind of site and transaction that we can measure and store in gigantic databases and manage through data structures. And I think there's some incredible value in that chain coming in the near future. It isn't necessarily going to mean that we do away with the kinds of shelf entry and exit kinds of activities that students have loved for 5 centuries and continue to do. It does mean that we can anticipate and guide and nudge and do things better if we have good data that we then turn around and employ in meaningful and good ways. And ultimately, like everything else, I think there is an AI dimension coming in college activity. It's not necessarily practical to have your mom texting you every morning to go to class, but having your local personal AI on your wrist that gives you the right kind of incentive and nudge and movement is probably going to be as worthwhile as any other field we can imagine with wanting or needing that kind of support. So I'm excited about all these new tools. I've gone looking for many of them. Not very many have been delivered yet. We don't have a lot of extra money to spend in the college sector, but at some point there's going to be a combination of academic, commercial, and technology interests that's going to fuel a real boom in enrollment management in particular. So I'm very excited about that. Okay, I'm ready to return the control to Sharon. If I can remember how to do that. Yeah, change presenter. Okay, and thank you very much for listening.
Jonathan, thank you. That was terrific. We really appreciate your insight and sharing that all with us today. Sharon, I think, has a number of questions that have come in that she's going to ask you to address for our audience today.
Great.
Yes, I do. And I'm going to begin with the first question. It's a pretty long one. Just give me a minute. So we have a question from Gabe. And So he says many schools are separated between enrollment management and student success. And when you look at student success across campus, it's usually much more disjointed versus the unity you see in EM. What advice do you have for brushing the gap between admissions and departments working with current students? Example, interdepartmental meetings, unified systems, etc.
Yes, it's interesting. Enrollment management, if you think of it as just a function and student success as another function, I think you're right. They're most often conceived separately and divided. I think in almost every practical dimension I can think of, they're really joined at the hip and need to be broadly integrated in as many ways as they can. That doesn't necessarily mean that the student success function belongs to the Chief Enrollment Management Officer, because there are so many things that a student success manager needs to pull in to their analysis that will involve other kinds of choices in the classroom, choices about program offerings, choices about graduation requirements, things that typically fall far beyond an enrollment management leader's purview. They're more of an engineer or a pilot in the way I described, and not big picture academics, or at least not big picture academics in the same way. So I think probably the single best solution is to understand that every part of the enrollment management operation needs counterpart liaisons in the student success operation. They're not necessarily needing to be joined under the same senior leader, although that probably helps on some level, that there's some convergence. They're not one reporting to a business officer and another one reporting to a provost, ultimately. But at the very least, extensive, regular, routine conversations and a whole lot of shared data. That's probably one of the biggest mistakes I think I've seen universities make, most universities make, is that the data collection and the data analysis functions are either put off into a different zone of IT or IR, and not designed to bring these two conversations together, or they are wholly housed within one or the other, and therefore you lose the practitioner knowledge. I'm a firm believer that if you're going to do a serious, even a self-study, you need practical experts on both sides of the study question, both retention, graduation, and upfront enrollment and selection. And then you need a couple of translators on their way to the statistician in between. You can't really do this as even a two-person operation. It's typically at least a three-person dialogue to really execute a good self-study well.
Well, perfect. I think that should answer his question. I'll wait for his response, what he says about it. And the next question, John, is, can you recommend strategies for improving international interest and prospective students?
International, I'm sorry, the question is about international student enrollment and success?
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Sure. That's been a sort of a specialty for us at Rochester. I'd say two things about it that I think are important. One is, the more gradual you can be, you may have a fiscal imperative for expanding your international horizons, but you need to argue as strenuously as you can for that not being a gigantic leap, but rather an incremental growth and change. You may have a leader who's strongly in favor of globalization or global mindedness in an expansive new way. That's terrific. But again, you have to crawl before you walk and walk before you fly. And I think it's important to set expectations over a multi-year horizon for getting where it is you want to go, a good old 5-year plan, if you will. But at the same time, as you go for an incremental kind of approach and not ramp up too fast or change things too fast, I do think it's good to have an anticipated outcome at the end that is much different than what I think most campuses have done or maybe even still think about doing. Right now, I think the most common approach is to think about adapting specific services and activities and even academic parts of the mission to an increasingly international audience or a very specific international audience. I don't think that's actually what you want to end up doing. You want to take all of your services, operations, programs, all of the conversations around campus that matter, from the athletic department to housing, to orientation, to healthcare services, all the things that you do, you need to sit down and re-envision what that means like to be done globally. It can be as simple as anticipating differences in language. Even people coming from England don't speak the same language as Americans, and looking at all of your publications, your websites, your programs to make sure you are not using America-centric language where you don't need to be. Even if you want to think about something as simple as, are you recruiting students from South Africa and Argentina and Australia? And if you are, you better get used to thinking about what fall and spring mean. They are a little bit different if you're out there communicating to people on the bottom half of the globe, if you will. But more importantly and more profoundly, every student, every adolescent student goes through culture shock when they come onto a campus. Even students who live 3 to 5 miles down the road do. So if you manage to think very carefully about what's going to make your Zimbabweans and your Russians and your Chinese students more successful, you are in fact thinking about things that are going to help all of your local students and your students from New York City and your students from California. So it's such a tremendous opportunity to have a commitment to globalize. It's not just a cash cow, money coming in the door from elites abroad who have a disposable income and want to spend it on American education. It is a truly great opportunity to transform everything you do, and it will then be to the benefit of all of your American students that are coming there too.
I'll quickly move to the next question. The next question is, how do you see the recent enrollment scandal impacting the role of an enrollment manager?
That's a really interesting question. I've been talking about with many colleagues and debating this now for, I guess, a week. I'd say there's a few things worth noting. One is, I was at least a little bit proud that out of 50 people being arrested, obviously most of them were parents, not one of them was an admissions person or admissions counselor. I don't want to make an inflated claim for what that means about the integrity of our profession, but I will say we have to think about this stuff almost all the time. Even if you're just a little bit selective, but you have specialized programs that are more selective, or if you give scholarships, you have to be aware and ready for the prospect that somebody's going to try to bribe you. And we have a very, very strong professional code of ethics. I wouldn't say it's necessarily right up there with medicine and law, but it is a very real code of ethics that's been around for 35 or 40 years. I don't think many people outside the admissions profession actually know that, but it's probably a pretty valuable thing to understand in the circumstance. That said, there are some questions that get raised about the degree to which we have channels in to the admissions process, and the scandal highlighted a couple of them. Most important one being recruited student athletes and the opportunity for coaches to put people on favored admissions lists and get that. You don't actually want to take that opportunity away. At least in the United States, fielding good sports teams matters not just at the Division I schools that were directly implicated, but at the Division III and other schools. It is a part of the fabric of campus life, and I think it's valuable in a way that goes beyond the actual students who are doing it. So you want to be able to tell a good volleyball coach that he can tell you about a good bumper or a good setter or somebody that needs to be in his retinue to fill out a good team. And if that student is pretty well qualified and they've got that special endorsement, that's a good match. There's plenty of proof that athletes not only add value while they're on campus to the campus culture in an important way, but athletes do better beyond campus, all out of proportion to what their grades and test scores would suggest. So these things matter and they're important. So I think we need to find some new double blinds. I was intrigued by the news about Georgetown and the innovation they'd done a couple of years ago of asking the coaches to put more meat around the bones of the referral and describing what is good and worth noting about that particular candidate in a more robust way. I think that's one potential solution, because we do live in a world in which we depend on and trust each other a lot. And obviously there were a handful of individuals, not very many across the whole range of coaches at colleges across the country, but there were a few individuals at a few places that proved unworthy of that trust.
Perfect, John. You're great with answering questions. I have another one, and it's quite a long one. So, do your matrix indicate that a campus visit improves likelihood that a prospect will enroll? Are college visits part of the acceptance decision process? If so, how do you address concerns regarding those who can't afford to travel to visit the campus?
This has been a big hot topic in admissions, the admissions world. I'd say this is not as important for the rest of enrollment management that I've talked about. But in the admissions world, this question of demonstrated interest goes back, I don't know, at least 20 years. And it is flustering and confusing for lots of people. And I think it's sort of misunderstood in some ways. We absolutely have good hard evidence, data-driven proof that students who visit campus are more likely to enroll. So if you find a college that's doing everything they can to get a student to come visit, including providing plane tickets and incentives and all kinds of programming around that, yes, they are acting on a data-driven imperative, and it's a right and smart thing for them to do. I would say that there is nothing else that we do that is as clearly well trusted and is as impactful in a student making a good, smart choice to attend that university or college. And I think that's where the confusion comes in. The caricature idea out there is that, well, if I just call every day and I check online all the time and make an impression and open every email multiple times and show up at the college fair, show up at the school visit, show up on campus over and over again, make a best friend of my admissions counselor, if I do all these sort of tricks of networking, that significantly enhances my chances to be admitted, and so I'd better do those things. And it is a series of tricks. It doesn't, if you have that viewpoint, it doesn't matter what is the quality of that interaction, it's just a quantity factor. From the standpoint of anybody in an admissions office, whether they do a lot of this or whether they claim that they don't do any of it, and I really think every college university does it on some level. If you think about it, that's what the coaches and the alumni are doing. They are providing another channel of outreach and connection that has an impact in the admissions process. But even if some college says we don't do demonstrated interest at all, what they are all certainly hoping for and aiming for and trying is to ensure that students understand why they're going to one campus over another. We are not interchangeable commodities. We are not all 100-acre wheat fields in Kansas. We have long histories. There's a lot of things that happened differently in the 169-year history of Rochester than what happened in the 159-year history of Cornell or whatever. There are influencers. There are entire faculties that are available in one place and not in another. There are the reactions to those faculties in one place or another. There are research places that are almost exclusively about that, with a little bit of liberal arts packed in the middle. There are professional schools with the same kinds of things. And then there are liberal arts colleges that still are interested in the research and that kind of part of the dialogue. So finding those nuanced, if you will, differences and making an appropriate choice, an appropriate match on that basis is really important. You can't overemphasize it. So I think it's legitimate if an admissions office says, wait a minute, this student that's applying, they've never visited, they've never called, there's no evidence they've ever looked at our website. Why are they applying? What do they understand about our curriculum and what they might do? And even asking the explicit question to do that. That said, this is like any other factor in admissions. We are always evaluating context. So we don't expect students with less money to earn as high a test score. We don't expect students in under-resourced high schools to have the same access to AP and multivariable calculus than students at less resourced high schools. We don't expect every Saudi Arabian to have the same level of obvious English proficiency as every American. So there's always context, even with the quote-unquote objective factors. There is absolutely context in this question of visiting campus. If you are low-income student who has a lot of great things going on and you live in El Paso and coming to Rochester is a 3-flight, $1,000 extravaganza, we are not expecting you to do that. That doesn't even enter our minds or the dialogue about whether or not you'd prove to be a good Rochester student. In that case, we expect to give you a lot of information in a different format, and we hope that you were able to take some time and respond to that information in that different format.
Perfect, John. I'm going to take the last question before I hand over the platform to John Wanamaker. So The last question is, how do you see the Common App impacting the role of admissions and enrollment manager?
Well, the Common App's been around since 1979, I believe. So it's grown recently. They've recently settled their long simmering lawsuit. So I think we'll see even better growth and more opportunities, and frankly, great opportunities to use Common App data. There's probably not a better data set in the world about the functions and activities of admissions. So there is a I don't want to say it's a falsehood, but there's a overinflated idea out there that the Common App, because there's 800 colleges on it, makes it just way too easy for colleges to apply to many schools. I saw the article last night about the young woman who had applied to 60-something and been admitted to 30-something, and there's stories like that every year, or students who get admitted to all 8 Ivies. And so the Common App is sort of blamed as an accelerator in this industry that makes it just too easy to apply to a lot of places. I don't actually think that is objectively true. I think there are other reasons that students are applying to more places anyway, whether they are Common App places or not. The biggest reason for that being is that an increasing fraction of our potential audience does not feel financially secure about what they're going to be able to do and whether or not going to be able to be on a particular campus. And so if you are not sure you're going to get the price that you think you need, it makes more sense to shop around more, just like we do the same thing with a car or a house when we were trying to get at it at a specific price. So a little bit of that expansion is going to happen anyway. And the idea that Common App is somehow contributing to that, I think, is misguided. The other thing is to recognize is that a whole lot of people only use the Common App to apply to one college. That's the whole nature of the early, which is also at least as fast growing a phenomenon in admissions, is applying early decision, early action, single choice early action. So there's a lot of people that are more and more getting away with only one application at all. And the Common App is not an important element in driving that behavior, obviously, in any particular way. So I think the Common App is a tool. I think it's valuable to have it work right. I don't think it's very much a driver of what we're experiencing as the market in admissions.
Thank you so much, John. And I would be moving to the next slide for grants with John Wanamaker.
Very good. Thank you, Sharon. And thank all of you for some terrific questions and great dialogue with Jonathan. Wanted to quickly just mention, as I did when we opened up our session today, that our talks today are sponsored by technology partners and other sponsors who allow us to bring these engaging conversations to you all, and also allow for the Campus Consortium to deliver a series of grants throughout the year to K-12 and higher ed institutions in a way that we hope to help facilitate innovation on campus using different enterprise technologies. I wanted to make everyone aware on the call today of a number of open grants that the Campus Consortium currently has running. These are open now and close later in the month of May 20th. We have a series posted here of grants that institutions can apply for partial or full grants to help implement some technologies to help deliver on a digital experience that their students and staff expect at their institution. So we have a student information system grant that is open, campus safety app, an AI for financial aid, an AI for admissions and enrollment, financial aid call center services grant, a multi-factor authentication grant open, as well as a campus portal grant. So please visit Campus Consortium for more information about those grants and to apply. On the next slide, I do want to mention our upcoming EdTalk with Mark Staples from the College of Charleston in Charleston, South Carolina. Mark will be hosting a session on March 28th from 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern Time right here in our GoToMeeting experience. So we will be following up with information on how to register for that session. If you have any other questions that you want to pose to Jonathan, we can forward those on to him in email and get back to you all. Otherwise, want to thank everyone for joining us today, encourage you to explore our open grants, and encourage you to join us for a conversation with Mark Staples from College of Charleston, where he'll be talking about making the jump to modern technology, what's in store for higher education institutions in 2019. Many thanks again to Jonathan Burdick of the University of Rochester for his outstanding presentation and conversation today. Sharon Das, our facilitator today, thank you very much for setting this up, and for all of our attendees today, we very much appreciate your time and interest and appreciate you joining our conversation. And I will sign off from here and thank everyone for joining. Take care.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye-bye.